Sometimes it doesn't seem that long ago when Bob and I were married, but on September 22nd, 2002, we will celebrate our 45th wedding anniversary. To mark the occasion, we decided to record the story of our lives, giving some history of Bob's family background as well as my own, and especially to look back on these past 45 years and share our recollections of the wonderful times we've enjoyed with our family and friends. This is our family story, which we hope will be enjoyed by our children, grandchildren, and the generations to follow. The summer of 1956 was a very special summer. I had spent my freshman year in college, made some friends, had a very good experience, but I was happy to be home for the summer. I'd missed my friends, and we had a lot of things scheduled that we wanted to do. Important things like playing tennis and going to Candlewood Lake. I met Bob on July 4th that summer. His parents, Jean and Al Busby, had just joined the Quaker Hill Country Club. My father, who was the club's membership chairman, had invited the Busbys and their 3 sons, Al, Bob, and Bruce, to our home for cocktails before the annual July 4th barbecue. And I was at that slightly rebellious stage where I said, well, Dad, I'm not sure I'm going to be here. I may have something to do or whatever. And he said, oh, I'd like you to be here. I said, well, maybe. And I played a little hard to get at that point. But anyway, when I looked out my upstairs window and saw these 3 handsome boys get out of the car, I spruced myself up and definitely participated. And I was very impressed. All 3 boys were terrific, but I, of course, really had my eye on Bob.
She was coming down the stairs, and I met her, and it was one of those things. It was an eye-to-eye thing, and of course I was about 24 then, and she was 17 or 18. I was maybe 23, 24.
I thought he was extremely handsome, which he is, and couldn't have been nicer, and was just very gracious, because he really asked questions about me, and I appreciated that very much.
So I met Valerie, and she is very athletic and tennis and things like that. And her father, of course, was an avid golfer, and he and I hit it off right away.
We spent a lot of time together the summer of 1956, playing tennis, golf, and especially water skiing on Candlewood Lake using my father's 15-foot Lyman boat. We became very attached to each other. We fell in love, but we didn't make too many serious plans. That fall, Bob went back to Colgate to finish out his last year, and I returned to Ohio Wesleyan as a sophomore. Bob would hop a train to visit me, and I would do the same. So we managed to see each other quite often that fall. He gave me his fraternity pin on a 25-foot fire lookout tower next to the Quaker Hill Country Club, which had a wonderful view of 4 states.
And it was quite romantic and heartfelt, and I just remember with great, affection and joy.
And so I wore a sorority pin with his fraternity pin next to it, and that told the whole world that we were a couple, and that was important stuff in those days. That Christmas, we became officially engaged. Bob gave me a gorgeous diamond ring. The diamond was from a ring that belonged to his father, so it had special meaning. My parents' Christmas party was also our engagement party, and it was wonderful. Especially memorable, Bob's roommate at Colgate, Doug Wilson, brought the Colgate 13, the college singing group, to perform at the annual Pauling Rubber Company Christmas party, and they stayed over at various homes in town. We had a huge snowstorm that year. The electricity went out, which only added to the excitement of having them there. After our engagement, and having completed my first semester of my sophomore year, I decided to leave Ohio Wesleyan and be closer to home and to Bob. And so I went to Catherine Gibbs in New York City and lived in New York for 4 or 5 months, a little bit more than that, 6 months, and learned, just really did very well at Katie Gibbs and worked hard so I could get the darn thing over with and get married and please my father and mother. Bob graduated from Colgate in June 1957 with a B+ average. He received more job offers from major companies than any other graduating senior, but my father convinced him to join the Polling Corporation as a salesman in the New England Territory, probably to keep us both closer to home. We were married in the chapel at Riverside Church on September 22, 1957. Jess Lyons, our family friend, officiated. I was 19 years old and Bob was 24. It was a small but lovely ceremony with close family friends attending. We had a dinner reception afterwards at the Essex House on Central Park South, and we've never regretted it. We were very happy with the decision we made. My father said, "Well, if that's the case and you don't want a big wedding, we'll give you $1,000 to go wherever you want." So we went to Bermuda and had a great time. And we actually had a couple of $100 left over when we returned to start our life together. But before we tell that story, let's go back in time and give you some history of our families and tell you about our early lives before we met. I was born in Worcester, Massachusetts on November 18, 1937. My father, Howard W. Smith, and my mother, Edith Johnson Smith, were living there because my father was the New England salesman for a cap and gown company. My father was born in Warren, Ohio, and my mother was born in Middlefield, Ohio. They were actually second cousins at a different generational level, and they had met occasionally at family gatherings as young children. Years later, both graduated from Ohio Wesleyan University, where they fell in love and married soon after. My mother's uncle is my father's grandfather, one and the same. His name was George Myron Smith. One of the legacies of GM, as he was called, is an important library which is now housed in the old manse where I grew up. My father's parents, Howard Wolcott Smith and Mabel Smith Cross, lived in St. Paul and Chicago, but were divorced when my father was in his teens. My father's mother was very special. Nana lived with us from 1940 until 1970 when she passed away at age 85. The lives of my parents and their ancestors can be found in greater detail in our video, The Story of Edith and Howard, which was made to celebrate their 60th wedding anniversary in 1994. When I was almost 2 years old, we moved from Worcester to Boylston, Massachusetts, about 7 miles away. It was absolutely a gorgeous little town. We lived in a big white colonial house, which my parents say they got for a steal, and they fixed it up. It was next to the church and overlooked the town common. I loved living there. Roger was born in 1940, and Nana came to live with us at that time. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, our country entered the war that had been raging in Europe and the Pacific. I was only 6 years old, but I was aware that this was a tremendous war. My father enlisted in the Navy, and he was away for 2.5 years. We missed my father, of course, but we were very happy in the little town of Boylston. I'm sure it was very hard on my mother, but she never showed it at all. Over 60 years later, in 2001, we visited Boylston, where the house still stands, and we spent time with my childhood friend Jerry Jones and his wife Rachel. It was fun to reminisce. Back in 1945, when the war ended, my father returned home and decided not to return to the cap and gown business. My uncle Smith Johnson, along with his friend Raymond Thornburg, had started a rubber company in Pauling and talked my father into joining their administrative team. It was a great opportunity, so we moved to Pauling. My brother Stephen, the third child, was born on June 16, 1946, in Massachusetts, just before the move was completed. My parents purchased an old Victorian house next to the library and near the church. It was formerly the manse for the church that had originally been located next door until 1938. Edith and Howard totally renovated the house, which had to be winterized for year-round use. It remains in our family to this day. We were very happy there. I was now 8 years old and went to a one-room schoolhouse right up the road, as did Roger. We each skipped a grade because there was only one person in our grade, so I was bumped up to fourth and he was bumped up to the second grade. But we really learned a lot. I don't know how we did it, but we did. As a result, Roger and I ended up at Pauling High School at a younger age than most. I was there for 3 years and then went away to St. Margaret's School in Waterbury, Connecticut, about an hour away. I went there because my friend was there, and it was a happy time. Summers on Quaker Hill were wonderful. Very few young people went to camp because everyone had so much fun around here. We had many famous people living in the area. Governor Dewey lived right down the road, as did Edward R. Murrow. Lowell Thomas did his daily broadcast from a studio which was on his property, and we could go and be a part of that broadcast, and that was a very special occasion. So there were very happy years growing up here. My grandmother stayed with us. She lived with us for 40 years, so she was part of the family. After I graduated from St. Margaret's School in 1955, I went on to college. My parents had both graduated from Ohio Wesleyan. It was a college that was well known in this community, and so I decided that's where I wanted to go too, and I loved it. I was there a year and then came back to Pauling for the summer, and that's when I met Bob Busby. Bob's ancestors have been traced back to the mid-1800s. His mother's family line came from Prussia, and his father's from Germany. Bob's mother was born on May 28, 1903. She was named Mabel Catherine McCall, but she was always called Jean. She was the youngest of 7 children. Her parents were Jenny Brohl and George McCall. Jenny was born in Tiffin, Ohio in 1861, and George McCall was born in Philadelphia in 1854. Unfortunately, they had both passed away by 1931, just 2 years before Bob was born, so he never knew them. Bob's father, Alfred W. Busby Sr., was born in August 1903 in New York City. He was the son of Alfred W. Busby and Dorothy Voigt, who had come here from Germany. Grandfather Busby was a butcher in Long Island, and Bob does recall his paternal grandparents at family gatherings when he was very little.
I was born on May 28, 1933 in Brooklyn, New York. And I don't remember, of course, too much in those early stages, but we moved in 4 years up to Garden City, Long Island, which was a beautiful town, and still kind of is. And my father was a commuter from Garden City to New York. He was in the stock brokerage business, and we had a lovely house in a rural area then. It was full of potato fields to our east, and now it's all, of course, been developed. But we really had a wonderful family life. My father was very successful at that time, and I had 2 brothers, and we had a terrific neighborhood. My mother, she was a homemaker, of course, and taking care of the 3 children. There were 3 of us, 3 years apart. And she was a very good golfer. We belonged to a nice country club. But she did a lot of community service work. I do remember that distinctly. She was a gray lady. Now, I think maybe that term only applied to women that did that during wartime, of course, which started in 41. I just remember some of the events. I remember President Roosevelt speaking, and of course seeing Pearl Harbor in pictures. I was 8 years old, and first thing I think we had to do, we had to paint our headlights halfway down. So you say you've got a 360-degree circle, of course. You'd paint 180 degrees so that the lights would always shine down on the road, because there was the concerned that the U-boats were off the Atlantic, in the Atlantic, off the eastern shore. And also we had air raid siren, what do you call it, test warnings, that they'd run. My father didn't go into the war, but he was deputized by the police department in Garden City to act as a deputy police officer. And I'm not sure that had any relationship to serving with the government at all, but that's what I do remember. He did not serve in the Army or Navy or any of the other services. One thing we did in Garden City a little later on, but I think we started at about 5 years old, stickball, which was a city sport. Now, I don't know whether anyone else kind of remembers that. It's with a broom handle and a tennis ball, and you try to knock it over the third house down. That was like a home run. First house was a single, and the second house. So those are kind of fun things. But it was a good start to a very enjoyable younger part of my life. And we did chores. My mother and father were great believers in hard work. So we had our chores, cutting the lawn and washing the car and keeping the shrubbery nice and neat. We got like 25 cents an hour, or we got to go to the beach the next day or something like that. But that early discipline was a very important segment of my life. We had an excellent school system in Garden City, one of the best. But my father decided when I was 15 years old to move to Brewster, New York. It was closer to a summer community where we spent our summers, and also he preferred the commute from Brewster to New York as opposed to Garden City. And we built a lovely home. We had our own pond. We went to Brewster High School, which from an academic standard was not comparable in any fashion or way to Garden City High School. I kind of coasted along. I remember I was fourth in the class of 40, and I didn't do anything. So I graduated fine from Brewster, just clear sailing. We had too much free time and things like that. Did a lot athletically. I'm very proud and humbled to say I got the Danforth Award for having the most potential and being the leader of the class or something like that. I wanted to most succeed. But anyhow, so I got to Colgate in 51, and the first 2 years I kind of didn't apply myself the way I should have, and I was like a C- D+ student. And I belonged to a fraternity which is very, very social in nature. And I had a wake-up call, which was probably one of the most important times in my life, because the dean came and said, Busby, and also the director of admissions said, you're not applying yourself and you're not working hard enough, and we're going to give you two choices. We want you to leave for a year. We'll accept you back as a full junior and either work for a year or go into the service. So what happened, Uncle Sam grabbed me right away, and I went in during the Korean War, which was a scary thing. Fighting in Incheon and places like that was very, very severe. And we got on a boat out of Seattle, and we got there the day after we arrived. The armistice was signed, and the DMZ was established, which was the demilitarized zone. I got over there as a qualified radio operator on handheld radio, which was very important in communicating our troops. We didn't have all this fancy electronic gear at that time. And I was called front and center by the First Lieutenant Murphy, and he said, Busby, front and center, I want you to run the PX. Do you think you can handle it? Because I was an economics and accounting major at Colgate. He said, I see you have a little background. And I said, yes, sir. Students, clicked my heels and saluted and said, yes, sir, Lieutenant Murphy, I will be more than happy to run the PX. And it was an extremely beneficial episode in my life. But what the discipline was that I was allowed a 1% operating deficiency in the books monthly was a PX. And that was, we did $30,000 a month, and I was allowed plus or minus $300 variance. And that was hard, because any business today, if you're plus or minus 5%, you're doing well. But 1% kept your nose to the grindstone, and that's what it did for me. So I was disciplined, but that 2 years was probably one of the most important parts of my life. They were formative years, and I got my attention back to where I should be going. I got an early release, and I was accepted back as a junior at Colgate, and I'm very pleased to say I was the most improved student. Of course, I had to be, because I was probably pretty low when I got back. I became the fraternity steward. I had a dry cleaning business on the side. Because I had to work my way through college. And my father came on bad times, tough times then. But so I met Valerie, and of course we were clicking along pretty well. And it's interesting, Edith said, when I talked to, of course, Howard Edith Smith, we talked a little about it, of course, and I'll never forget Edith telling me that he said, well, Valerie's only 19, or something like that. And so, but we were able to get through that. She was mature, and I felt that I'd I'd done a lot of things, and of course I had the service behind me, which was extremely important. And I worked several wonderful job opportunities, and I think that's when Howard got involved in possibly considering me for a sales position. But anyhow, everything just clicked, and it worked out very well.
After Bob and I were married, we moved to a little apartment at 63 Milton Street in West Hartford, Connecticut. Bob traveled throughout New England selling rubber and plastic products for Pauling Rubber Company. I worked briefly for Liberty Mutual to try out my katykids education, and I was doing pretty well there, but Bob was traveling 3 or 4 days a week, and we really missed each other. So I decided to leave my job and travel with Bob. I could help out with his files and keep notes, and we would be together. When I became pregnant, it was wonderful because we both wanted children right away. My mother bought us a beautiful antique cradle in Danbury, and Nana taught me to bake bread. Bob's mother, Jean, gave me some good advice at my baby shower at Eileen Doe's house. It was about patience, as I recall. Scott was born at Hartford Hospital on January 20th, 1959, and coincidentally, our doctor's name was Dr. January. Everyone adored Scott. Bob's parents were so helpful when Scott came home from the hospital. When Scott was about 4 months old, my father thought it was time for Bob to come back to the main office in Pauling and take on a more administrative position. We rented a little red house owned by Cecile and Ralph Carson. We paid $125 a month, and we were a little worried if we could afford it. It was great to be near our families and Nana, and near the church where I attended since childhood. Scott was baptized here in June of 1959. We enjoyed the little red house very much. It was adorable, although it was a bit drafty. Bob's parents came often and really enjoyed their grandchild. Being that Scott was born on January 20th, every 4 years, his birthday coincided with the inauguration of the President of the United States. In 1961, John F. Kennedy took office the day we were to celebrate Scott's 2nd birthday. There was so much snow here that day, we had to cancel the birthday party, but Grandfather put on snowshoes and came up for cake and ice cream anyway. The party was actually celebrated a few days later. Our first dog, Barney, was a pal for Scott. Briefly, he was much too boisterous for our young family, so we soon gave Barney to a teenager in Pauling. Scott swung his first golf club on the backyard of the Little Red House, and he's loved golf ever since. 1960 was a big year for snowstorms, and Susan's birth took place right in the middle of one in March. We went to New Milford through the snow, and Susan was born the next day at the hospital on March 4th, 1960. Scott was really excited about having a baby sister. Susan and Scott enjoyed our little house. They played well together. And we enjoyed an occasional trip to see the animals at Birch Hill Game Farm. I was really happy to have a little girl, and I enjoyed her curious personality. Where Scott was very easygoing, Susan was more strong-willed and quite a bundle of joy to handle. We visited Grandmother and Grandfather often, and Susan had several pretty dresses that Gran bought for her in Paris during a trip to Europe. Grandmother did take note in a Christmas card that Susan had a certain devilish streak, which was certainly true. Nana was such an important part of the family, and she really enjoyed being a great-grandmother. In the spring of 1961, I was expecting our 3rd child, and it was very obvious our little red house was much too small. Fortunately, we were able to purchase 4 acres on Reservoir Road from my father and Mr. Thornburg. Our new house was delivered in early May. It was a national home, a prefabricated structure. The house was started on May 5th, and Stephanie was born on May 9th, 1961, while we were in the midst of packing to move. She was the easiest child. I went to the hospital, had her, and came home the next day. She was a real joy. We moved into our new home in the middle of June. The price was $17,500, and with upgrades like a fireplace, stonework on the front, and expanded living room, the final price was about $30,000. Shortly after we moved in that June, Stephanie was baptized together with Michael Collette and Tom Tyree. Dr. Lankler officiated. Michael became Steph's best friend. Meanwhile, Scott cut Susan's bangs right to the scalp, and it took all summer for them to grow out. We loved the house and the property. We were close enough to town, so Bob came home for lunch every day. Our first Christmas here was a joyous occasion, and we now had plenty of room for our 3 children. Life at our new home included birthday parties and other special occasions. It was a pretty busy place. Bob and his mother shared a May 28th birthday with special celebrations, usually strawberry rhubarb pie and chocolate cake. Andy was born February 4th, 1963. Her older brother and sisters adored her. She was a wonderful addition to the family. It was in November of 1963 that John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and that made a big impression on our family. We just couldn't believe something like this could happen. Scott was only 5 years old, and I told him to never forget this sad day, which he says he hasn't. The other children were probably too young to realize this tragedy, and we had to move on with our lives. Andy made her Christmas card debut that year. She was a very cheerful child, and she and Steph got along well. We were very saddened during the summer of 1964 to lose both of Bob's parents. His mother, Jean, died in June, having been very sick for several years with ALS. His father, Al, died in late August of a heart attack. Although he had spent time with all of us that summer, he was basically very lonely and depressed. They were both only 60 years old. During this decade, Roger and Betty Smith, Al and Barbara Busby, and Sandy and Bruce Busby were married. Allison Busby was born in 1962 and Missy Busby in 1963. Ken and Bill Busby were born in June of 1965, and we could never tell them apart, but the kids always knew. Kelly Busby was born in 1968. Our family had fun times with the cousins at summer outings in Cape Cod or at each other's homes. The Christmas holidays were especially festive wherever we were. The year Judy and I did the Christmas Bazaar with all the kids helping was especially memorable. Summers at the lake during these years were wonderful with our 4 small children. We went in the morning, came home for naps, and often went back later. With 4 children, we were always busy, so having Leslie, our au pair for one summer, helped out a lot. Highlights of trips in the 60s included a trip to Florida where we visited the Tuthills, Sandy Busby's parents, and enjoyed the sun. Then there was our first and last cruise. In 1966, we took Scott and Susan to the Caribbean on a cruise ship, Franconia. One of the activities directors turned out to be a friend of Edith's, Marge Hartnett, and we still hear from her. We had fun on the beaches, but we were very glad when we arrived back home. Our big trip was in 1968 when we went with Edith and Howard to the Olympics in Grenoble and visited other major cities as well. Bob and I went to Rome first. We visited with French friends and American friend Christy Sample, who was studying in France. We were gone for 1 month and missed the children very much. Reverend and Mrs. Sparks stayed at our house, and we exchanged lots of cards and letters. Once again, we were very happy to be back home. There were many busy school years in the 60s. Scott started kindergarten, and he enjoyed school. He made many, many friends. His special friend, Bobby Sherlock, was the son of the new elementary school principal, Jay Sherlock. Susan wore glasses when she went to kindergarten. She really liked school. She enjoyed good friends and had many excellent teachers. Stephanie was totally tuned into kindergarten, having heard all the stories from Scott and Susan. She liked school all the way along. Andy went off to kindergarten in her new dress from B. Altman and Company and enjoyed school most of the time. She received an award for physical fitness and started playing tennis at a young age with amazing confidence. Andy made friends with Jenny Collette and Katie Hollander, daughters of my good friends Judy and Barbara. Craig was born on March 22, 1969, and everyone loved him from the start. He slept in the cradle Grandmother had given us years before, and later in a crib in a room he shared with Andy. On a visit, he was observed closely by cousin Stacy, who had been born the year before and lived nearby. One of Craig's baby pictures was published in the News Chronicle with a totally appropriate caption. 2 days after Craig's birth, Stephen Busby was born to Al and Barbara, who lived in Armonk at the time. We had a good time with the two boys so close in age. We had lots of energy in the 70s, and we certainly needed it for all the ambitious trips we planned. In 1972, we took our first long car trip to Disney World in Orlando for Christmas. It had just opened, and we took the 4 older children. Craig stayed with Grandmother and Grandfather and enjoyed spending Christmas with them. On the way, we stopped at the colonial village of Williamsburg. We crossed the James River by ferry and then went on to visit Marineland. We finally arrived at Disney World, staying at the Polynesian Hotel, a beautiful place. We all loved Disney World. Celebrating Christmas in a hotel room was better than we thought. On the drive home, we stopped for a romp on Flagler Beach, then drove on to Charlotte, North Carolina, where we spent New Year's Eve with Sally and Spencer Clark and their 4 children. Our next big trip was during the summer of 1973. We rented a 28-foot Travco motorhome to take all the kids for a 7-week voyage across the country and back. Andy was so excited the morning we left. Craig was momentarily upset because we couldn't take his tricycle. After traveling on Route 80 across Pennsylvania, a very boring trip, we visited with friends Connie and Don Rebar in Ohio. Craig even had a riding lesson with Betsy Rebar. In Cleveland, Scott and Bob played golf with Uncle Lou Johnson, a cousin of Edith's. From there, we went on to Michigan and had a barbecue with the Wayans and the Einans. Craig enjoyed the company of Heather Wayand, but apparently he wasn't so thrilled with Kimberly Einan. Next on the itinerary was Chicago, where we visited the Saccaros. The men enjoyed a game of golf, and we had a picnic with the Dolphins and their 5 children. We drove on to Edina, Minnesota to see Tom and Ann Carrier. Craig enjoyed all the attention. The Badlands were quite amazing. All the locals took notice when our big van with a Busby sign entered Busby, Montana. We visited Margie Schroth in Billings, Montana. It was her first summer out west. Driving into Yellowstone National Park was awesome. We set up our campsite, always on the lookout for bears. Craig played cowboys and Indians with our neighbors at the camp. We saw Old Faithful erupt, and it was right on schedule. The scenery at Grand Teton National Park was spectacular, and the kids got the opportunity to go fishing. And in the true Western spirit, horseback riding was a must. We didn't like the Nevada desert, especially Craig, so we were really happy to get to Santa Clara, California to visit the Watsons and get in a little more golf. In San Francisco, we ate up a storm at Fisherman's Wharf. We actually spent a day in Tijuana. Craig finally had a chance to visit Disneyland, and we really enjoyed all of California. On our return trip, we visited the Busbys in Atlanta. Then we headed for Pauling, and it felt really good to be back home. Family events in the 1970s included Steve and Kathy's wedding in 1971 in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. It was a lovely wedding, and Stephanie was the flower girl. Edith and Howard celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary at Dutchess Valley Rod and Gun Club in 1974, another happy occasion. Trips to the Greenbrier for RMA conventions were a special treat during those years. Often Edith and Howard attended, and usually 2 of our children came along. We fit in a trip to HF Bar Ranch in the mid-70s. Margie's family was really growing. Lots of new cousins arrived in this decade. Todd Smith was born in 1970, as was Lisa Busby. Jason Smith arrived in 1972. Steamer Smith in 1973. Elliot Smith was born in 1976. Craig started school and was a happy fellow. He liked school. He spent lots of time with the Allen and Smith children. Sharon Murray, our wonderful babysitter, helped so much with Craig during these years and was great at birthday parties, or just when the neighborhood children got together. Her help was especially appreciated when we had Fresh Air children visit for 2 weeks in the summer. Every summer we joined other Fresh Air families for the annual hayride. We saw a lot of the Colettes during these years. We had good times with all the Busbys and enjoyed an occasional visit with the Adams children from Cincinnati. Andy and Steffi were crazy about horses, and Blackjack joined the family in the mid-70s. Riding at McCarthy's was an everyday occurrence, often with Andy's friend Mary Frances. Sometimes Mary Dinsmore would ride Muffin over to see Steph. Andy, and sometimes Steph, competed in local horse shows with great success. In 1976, there was a bicentennial celebration on Muller's Fields with Andy and friends participating. We were all impressed with the colorful performance. Summertime events at the country club kept us all busy. We played tennis and golf during the day and attended parties at night. Bob was president of the club in 1974. That year, he also won the Directors' Cup tournament. Paul and Barbara Falls came in 1976, replacing Mac Jessamine, whom everyone loved. In the fall, we often went to football games at Yale with friends, relatives, and co-workers. In the winter, we went to Stratton to ski and had a great time with Kent, Margaret, and their family. Edith and Howard came up once to get the flavor of wintertime in Vermont. The era of children leaving home began in 1975 when Scott went to Hotchkiss. He graduated in 1977. Before going away to school, Susan and Steffi excelled in field hockey at Pauling High School. Susan then went on to Kent School. She graduated in 1978. Stephanie was one of the few girls at Trinity Pauling. She graduated in 1979. Andy followed Steph to Trinity Pauling, and she graduated in 1981. We were now poised for the 80s. We started off this decade with a great trip to Lake Placid for the Winter Olympics. We stayed at the big farmhouse owned by Ross and Thane. Susan and her friends visited us from nearby St. Lawrence. Scott was curious about Central America and went to Guatemala for a semester. He graduated from Amherst in 1982. Following graduation, he traveled to Scandinavia with grandmother and grandfather. When he returned, he took a job in California as a teacher at Sacramento Day School. He went on to get his master's in sociology at the University of California at Berkeley. During Scott's California years, Bob and I went to California often, on business and to see Scott. Susan attended St. Lawrence University for 2 years, and then she transferred to Wheelock near Boston. She graduated in 1982 with a teaching degree. Dave Daniels, the reason for Susan's transfer to the Boston area, graduated from Boston Law School. Susan and Dave were married on August 14, 1982. The next year, Matthew David Daniels was born. Fortunately, the proud great-grandmothers lived nearby. Matt and cousin Pat Daniels were great pals. 3 years later, Megan arrived. Pat's little sister Lauren made the foursome complete, and they all had a lot of fun together. Meanwhile, back on the higher education scene, Stephanie went on to St. Lawrence with Wendy Berkeley. She lived in London for a semester, and Bob, Craig, and I visited her, traveling by train to Scotland for sightseeing and golf. She worked summer jobs at an ice cream parlor at Block Island and even did a brief stint at Pauling Corporation. Steph then transferred to the University of New Hampshire, graduating in 1983. Andy went to Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania as a French major. She spent her junior year in Besançon in eastern France. She regularly wrote long letters home. Once again, Bob, Craig, and I took the opportunity to visit her there. We traveled in Switzerland and visited Jean-Louis and Dominique. Before coming home, Craig flew directly to Barbados at the invitation of David McCarthy's grandparents, a very special trip. Andy graduated from F&M in 1985. Meanwhile, Craig had gone to the Taft School in 1984. His advisor and English teacher was Willie McMullen. Susan and Dave had bought a house in Watertown, Connecticut, near Taft, and Matthew spent time at Taft activities. Craig graduated in 1985. He went on to Colgate University, Bob's alma mater. Attending Colgate with Craig were Steve Busby, his cousin, and Lori Sizik, daughter of longtime friend John Sizik. Craig really liked Colgate, and family members visited often. He played on the golf team, sometimes with surprising scores. Before graduating, Craig did a sea semester, sailing from Portugal to St. John's in the Caribbean. Andy met him in St. John's for a nice reunion. Craig graduated in 1991, with the proud fathers beaming. One of our better parties in the 80s was Bob's surprise 50th birthday party at our house in 1983. A golf game kept him away from the house during the day, while everyone gathered to surprise him, and they did. He loved the cards and poems and appreciated the VCR which the group gave to him. Several trips were memorable in the 80s, such as going to Cancun during the spring of Andy's senior year at Franklin and Marshall. Andy's roommate Megan and her brother Eric joined us there. We visited Chichen Itza and really blended in with the local scene. We had a great time. In 1985, we rented a condo in Hawaii with Scott, Andy, and Craig. The kids drove to Hana, and I think it's just as well we didn't go. Andy and I froze watching the sunrise at Haleakala, a volcanic crater. Another trip to England and Scotland happened in 1987 with Ross and Fane, Bruce and Sandy, and Edith and Howard. We spent time in the Cotswolds, and of course the men loved the golf. We especially enjoyed visiting the little village of Busby near Glasgow. In 1989, we bought a wonderful little place in Florida. We spent Christmas there the first year. We always headed for water when the Hollanders and Smiths visited. Bob, Kay Parati, and the Nelsons were usually among the golf winners. We visited our minister, Bern Brunsting, and enjoyed many nice dinners. We were so pleased to have several nice occasions with Dr. and Mrs. Peel and Edith and Howard. Craig had great success fishing, and Matt and Meg had fun playing on the beach and looking for eagles. Coffee was always happy with a walk or a ride. There were many wonderful times at Harbor Ridge. There were 3 wonderful and memorable weddings in the 90s. Andy and John Rickert had known each other for several years and were married on June 29, 1996, on a beautiful day at Christ Church in Quaker Hill. They posed for the photographer at the library and in Edith's garden. The reception was on our side lawn. Anne and Scott had rekindled their friendship and romance. We enjoyed a wonderful evening meeting the Gluskers at their New York City apartment. Anne and Scott were married on July 18, 1996, in Bridgehampton, Long Island. The rehearsal the day before was fun and very, very casual. The wedding was held on the lawn of the summer home of Lil and Irwin, Anne's parents, with a field of sunflowers adorning the area. Emma, Aaron, and Kara, and Finn and Will were involved, and it was a beautiful ceremony. Everyone gave personal tributes and good wishes. The reception was a great party. At this point, Craig was attending lots of weddings and wishing that he would find just the right girl. Through his flying instructor, he met Lynn Anderson. They met and they hit it off right away, and they were engaged pretty quickly. Craig had 2 bachelor parties. One was at Harbor Ridge. The other was in New York City. The Colettes gave a shower for the couple. Craig and Lynn were married March 7, 1998. In the early 90s, we were all thoroughly enjoying Matthew and Megan, our only grandchildren. Meg and Lauren had good times together, too. The cousins were often together. The next 10 years would bring 7 more grandchildren. Emma, Aaron, and Kara were born November 29, 1991. They were healthy, but tiny. They received wonderful care and were soon home. Everyone helped out, and of course the grandmothers were especially busy. They were all a happy bunch, and Susan and Dave managed very, very well. Henry Smith Rickert was born May 20th, 1998. Right away, you could see that he had an adventurous personality. He loves trains of all kinds, mainly Thomas trains, and knows every single train by name. Martin Alfred Busby Glusker was born June 18, 1999. A great joy to his parents and welcomed by all. He enjoys new experiences and grew up quickly. He became good friends with his cousin Henry. William Robert Rickert was born September 24, 2000. He is a special boy and really loves golf. And he has a good sense of humor, too. Julia Valerie Lowe Busby was born November 10, 2000, in China, and lived in an orphanage until November 5, 2001, when she was adopted by Stephanie. Julia showed her special personality, amusing everyone with her adorable Popeye face. Many friends were made on the trip, and Steph and Julia see the other children fairly often. Julia was welcomed by all the family at home. She adapted quickly to life around here. We enjoyed a number of trips in the 90s, but one that stands out is our trip to Ireland in 1995. We went with the Chalfonts, the Carriers, and the Rebars, and all had matching green sweaters thanks to Bob. We enjoyed the lively pubs, as well as the elegant times at Adair Manor. We traveled to golf courses and went sightseeing on a small bus with non-stop Irish jokes playing over the loudspeaker. We had a really good time. Of special importance to note in the 90s are the much sought-after graduate degrees. Scott received his law degree from Bolt Hall. Stephanie received a degree in psychology and education from Columbia Teachers College. Susan received her teaching degree from Marymount College. And Craig received his MBA from RPI on May 18, 2002, with 3 inches of snow. Unbelievable. Graduations in the Daniels family have started already. Emma, Aaron, and Kara graduated from Tots and Us in 1996. Megan went to Dutchess Day School with Lauren and graduated in 2000. Matthew went to Trinity Pauling first and graduated from Millbrook School in 2002. During the 90s, everyone lived and worked in interesting places. Scott moved from life in California to Washington, where he worked for the INS, the National Security Council, and the State Department, all at different times. Steph and Andy lived and worked in New York City for close to 10 years. Steph was in human resources and Andy worked for Estee Lauder. Craig was at Trinity Pauling as a teacher and coach for 3 years before joining the team at Pauling Corporation in 1994. John Rickert began his career at Pauling Corporation in July of 1996. In 1998, Susan and Lisa Daniels started the Mizentop Day School at Christ Church on Quaker Hill, and within 4 years expanded to a larger facility. Through all these years, parties have brought family and friends together. Grandmother's 90th birthday was held on our deck in 1999, with every family member participating, especially in singing, A, you're adorable, B, you're so beautiful, and so on. We squeezed in a baby shower as well for Anne. Beautiful weather made it special. The last big bash of the 20th century happened New Year's Eve at Godetti's restaurant. We have had lots of animal friends over the years. Heidi was our first family dog, followed by Chemo the Wanderer. Then came Jiminy and Cricket. Jiminy was one of the 9 puppies born to Cricket. Toffee was the last and the best. Our cats have been numerous and all good companions. Usually they chose us rather than the other way around. And yes, there were the rabbits. Snickers, Thumper, Whiskers, and Eleanor and Franklin have been part of the family too. The game of golf has been a source of pleasure for Bob all his life, especially since the early days at Quaker Hill. He's played in many interesting places with family and friends. Golf games and tournaments nearby fill the calendar as well. Often the golf professionals were part of the social gatherings afterwards. A big success for Craig was winning the Dutchess County Amateur Golf Tournament in the mid-90s. My golf isn't too bad considering the time I devote to the game. Bob and I have played with friends on trips and in tournaments. Couples occasions at Moorfar always end up with a wonderful time afterwards. On Friday the 13th in July of 2001, I did get a hole-in-one at Quaker Hill Country Club, and that was a big achievement for me, and I was very proud. What's made all the good times possible has been the hard work and accomplishments at Pauling Corporation, our family business. It has survived through good and bad times and established a fine reputation in the industry. Plans are underway for the succession of the third generation of family to provide the leadership needed to move forward into the future. These past 45 years have been full of such wonderful times with our family and friends. Each and every moment we treasure deeply.
The secret of life is enjoying the passage of time. Any fool can do it. There ain't nothing to it. Nobody knows how we got to the top of the hill. Since we're on our way down, we might as well enjoy the ride. The secret of love is in opening up your heart. It's okay to feel afraid, but don't let that stand in your way. 'Cause anyone knows that love is the only road. And since we're only here for a while, might as well show some style. Give us a smile, isn't it a lovely ride? Sliding down, gliding down. Try not to try too hard, it's just a lovely ride. Now the thing about time is that time isn't really real. It's just your point of view. How does it feel for you? Einstein said he could never understand it all. Planets are spinning through space. Smile upon your face. Well, welcome to the human race. Some kind of lovely ride. I'll be sliding down, I'll be gliding down. Try not to try too hard, it's just a lovely ride. Isn't it a lovely ride? See me sliding down, gliding down. Try not to try too hard, it's just a lovely ride. Secret of life is enjoying the passage of time.